Some big news on inflation today with a larger than expected drop, but it is not all good, especially if you are on benefits, as we will explain. It's been a better week for Keir Starmer as his big investment summit passed off pretty well, until that is, he was hit by the huge scandal of his meeting with Taylor Swift behind the scenes at her concert. The most baffling news story of the year. I mean, what are we, 5 years old? Welcome to Talking Politics. As ever, I'm joined by Robert and Anushka. Look, lots of serious stuff to talk about. We should talk about inflation. We should talk about the budget, because I feel like we should always talk about the budget every day until everyone's sick of the budget. And I know kind of we're getting the shape of it. But let's talk about something less highbrow first, Taylor Swift. I love the fact, that's one of the things I love about the news industry, is that not everyone agrees about what is a news story and what is not a news story. I think Robert and I agree on this. You don't necessarily agree. I think Robert and I had a long chat last night. We're kind of like, can't understand. Taylor Swift is coming here. She's spooked by a terror threat in Vienna or where it was. She wants protection. The Met won't do it. The government leans on them. Keir Starmer goes and says hello and welcomes her. Is that a big deal? I just can't understand.
I think any story that involves the Prime Minister and Taylor Swift is a story in itself, yeah?
Why?
Just because they are two of the most famous people in this country and across the world.
It's an item for a gossip column. It's not a news story.
Well, I don't actually completely agree. This is taxpayer money. There's a method in which it's usually deployed. It's usually deployed by a decision made by the police. The government repeatedly says it's an operational decision, but it turns out that the government lent on the Met Police in order to provide the protection, which, by the way, may be completely reasonable. I think they should come out and explain it if they want to say, as they have, and I think they've hinted at this, yes, she faced a really serious terror threat, and so we want her to come to this country because actually she's so popular. Doesn't she move inflation when she comes to the country?
So just to be clear,
it's a good thing for the economy. Yeah. All of these things are interesting and in the public interest.
Okay, just before Rob,
I don't think she faced a very serious terror threat. I don't think they're going to be able to say that. I mean, she may or may not have done, but I don't think that's what happened here. I think what happened here is that she decides she's a billionaire, right? She's really shocked and upset by what happens in, the appalling murders of those children at a Taylor Swift event. Really shocked and upset by that. Then she gets the threat in Austria. And she decides that she is just not in an emotional, psychological state to do these huge concerts in London. And so she tells Universal, her record company, she wants to pull out, right? At that point, Universal talks to the Home Secretary and the Mayor of London. And they then try to persuade the police to, increase the protection that she will have as a way of reassuring her. Now, these are economically, one of the most extraordinary things about Taylor Swift is when she goes to a city, the GDP of that city increases. It is astonishing, right? She is a phenomenon in music like none we've ever seen before. I sort of get that the Home Secretary and the Mayor of London would think it's sort of bad for London if these concerts get cancelled.
So make that argument, absolutely.
I get why they give the police protection. I think after all of this, look, I, like you, don't quite understand why you're a new Prime Minister. There's an enormous amount going on, and you feel you have to go to Taylor Swift twice. I don't get it, but that's his choice. But that is his choice, right?
Okay, I just want to chip.
And I also don't think it's a scandal that he has a chat with her at the end of the concert.
No, I just want to chip in one thing here, which is that surely it would be a bigger story. I mean, we've agreed she's a massive pop star. She moves the economy. We want her to come here because she's got lots of fans, because it's good for our economy. She's potentially not going to come here because she's frightened. We've all been around in this business long enough to know the Met Police doesn't get everything right, and that is putting it very politely.
I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that.
All I'm saying is wouldn't it be a bigger story if it turned out the government refused to intervene, refused to offer her security,
Maybe it would,
and she
yeah.
cancelled that? They intervened, and wouldn't you want the Prime Minister to go and see, he's at the concert anyway, to go and see her and say, very glad you came, glad we could help, blah, blah, blah. I mean, isn't that what you expect your Prime Minister to be doing?
Well, then they can come out and explain that. But the problem that he's got is it's across a backdrop of him having claimed £107,000 of freebies.
Which is a big deal.
Which, by the way,
and he's given the money back for those, right?
He's given the money back for the Taylor Swift concert after the election. I assume not the one before the election, because there's some magical dividing line between when you're Prime Minister and Leader of the Opposition. I did find it a bit weird. When I was looking at the picture, I was like, I'm sure he went to that Taylor Swift concert before the election, and then you realise he went twice. Agree. Isn't he a bit busier than that? I just think I'm not making any argument on either side of any of this, and I perfectly think it's reasonable for them to say that she should be provided with protection. Is it a story? Yes, it's a story, because they aren't coming out clearly and explaining what happened. It's very clear that the Met Police only made the decision because of government interference in that decision, which might be completely justified. On top of that, you've got a picture of the Prime Minister twice at a Taylor Swift concert and going to chat to her backstage. Yes, it's a story, whether or not you agree or disagree that it's a scandal.
I think as a news industry, we have to make slightly more clinical and responsible decisions about what's a story.
Which is why we haven't covered it until now.
And I think this is a ridiculous story. I don't think it's a story at all. I don't think the government's
even
required to explain it.
Even with the backdrop, if the backdrop wasn't there, then it wouldn't be so interesting, which is, here's the guy who everyone's angry with for taking all these freebies, one of which happened to be Taylor Swift. And, oh, by the way, his government also urged the Met to provide extra money for her.
But that is a story. The backdrop is a story. We've all agreed on that. We can't understand, I think all of us, why he had to take 100,000 quid's worth of gifts, why he was getting designer glasses. Man, why can't you pay for your own suits and your own glasses, for God's sake?
We've covered that, and we think it's a story, right?
Yeah. I just feel like we have to exercise some judgment. Otherwise, we lose the attention of our viewers.
Why are we sitting here talking about it then? Let's talk about inflation figures.
It's kind of interesting.
I thought you said it wasn't interesting. Let's talk about inflation.
I think what's interesting is that I think it's kind of weird that it's played out as it has, and that
so
I
we're
just
like
find
talking
puzzling.
about the media around the media.
Yeah, we are. Okay, you're quite right. We stand corrected.
Also, I just think anything involving Taylor Swift and the Prime Minister is interesting.
Let's talk about something more important. Inflation. Who wants to go? Who wants to go? I mean, it's
good. Basically, inflation coming down is good news, because it means cost of living pressures are easing. It means that interest rates may well come down a bit faster and a bit more than we had been expecting. All of that is straightforwardly good news. I think it is a political headache for the government, because we think this is a blip. So, for example, it doesn't include the recent rise in energy prices. It doesn't take account of that, right? And the point about this 1.7% announcement today is it will determine how much benefits for people on low incomes go up in the spring. And many people will say these are people, really struggling, using food banks, living in poverty, and the rise in the benefits they will receive will be based on an anomaly, a temporary fall, and cost of living pressures are rising again, and essentially the government will be under, I think, pressure. Government will, on one hand, say, thank goodness, we're not going to have to put up benefits more given we haven't got any money, but they will face pressure from charities and from their own backbenchers to actually do more than the 1.7% when it comes to increasing benefits, because many people will say this will leave millions of people in poverty.
And obviously, although the uprating doesn't happen until next April, the decision will have to be announced in the budget, which is in a couple of weeks. So we will... Or is it even next week? I'm losing track of time.
It's the week after next.
So they have to make
We're talking about it every day, so we think it's tomorrow, but actually it's not. It's
Wednesday.
So they have to make the decision now. But this is always a bit of an issue, which is that the September inflation figure is used to uprate benefits in April, so there is a lag. And previously, we've had a kind of opposite kind of scandal to this, which was that inflation was massively high and the government tried or thinking about uprating by a lower level, earnings level, rather than the lagged inflation level. And now we obviously have the flip of that. I mean, it would be quite a big deal if they uprate by higher than that level, but they'd have to take that decision that it was a blip, and it is a blip.
But there is also something weird about the fact that pensioners, I mean, obviously pensioners are under pressure because of the removal of the winter fuel credit, but the state pension goes up in line with earnings, and it was last month's earnings figure, not even this month's earnings figure. And, it means pensioners will be getting a multiple of the 1.7% in terms of the basic state pension going up.
We are, as usual, recording on a Wednesday, and that, of course, means PMQs. Today was one of the last times we'll see Rishi Sunak behind the dispatch box, and his focus this week was the government's approach to China. The exchanges started off fairly cordial, and then, well, have a listen.
The last government also established a new system of registration and monitoring to protect the UK from interference from foreign states, including China, Russia and Iran. Called the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, it was described as essential by MI5 in the fight to help keep Britain safe. But since the Prime Minister took office, he has halted its implementation. Why?
That isn't correct.
Rishi Sunak.
Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee have warned that British universities are increasingly a rich feeding ground for China to exert political influence over us. That's why we passed the Freedom of Speech Act with new powers to help defend universities from this threat, but the new Education Secretary has since blocked it. So can the Prime Minister tell us how, without this tool, the government will prevent Chinese influence over our universities?
I really don't think party political points on security intelligence.
The Chinese government has sanctioned multiple members of our parliament for championing human rights. As a result, they have faced intimidation, abuse and surveillance. So this week, will the Foreign Secretary in his meetings not just raise the issue, but tell the Chinese government to lift those sanctions on our colleagues?
Yes, and we speak with one voice. He speaks about the record of the last government. That record was 14 years of failure. 6 years austerity, 3 years of Brexit logjam, then Johnson Trust and the leader of the opposition, utter failure.
Rishi Sunak taking a pretty serious tack, talking about China. What did you both make of it?
Well, I thought it was a serious question, an important question. We've seen these war games being played by China around Taiwan. The risk, the threat that there'll be a blockade or even an invasion by China remains one of the great threats to world stability and indeed to economic stability, because it would cut off the supply of semiconductors that the entire global economy is dependent on, because, essentially Taiwan has a near monopoly of these important semiconductors in terms of manufacturing. So it's a really serious threat that China is posing. I completely understood in terms of, I suppose, the importance. I mean, it wasn't party political, except actually, weirdly, Keir Starmer managed to turn it into something party political. For most of the back and forth, they were sort of agreeing with each other about the seriousness of this threat. But then the leader of the opposition, Rishi Sunak, said that he was concerned that the government was delaying the implementation of something called the Foreign Influence Registration Regime or Scheme, which is where you have concerns about some kind of institution operating in Britain that they may in some senses be undermining, our democratic structures or may pose a threat to security. They have to register. And this was introduced by government in the previous government in legislation. When he was accused by Sunak of delaying the scheme, Starmer just looked incandescent. His face went white, he clenched and he just said, no, that's not true. Actually, it is true, right? In August, the Home Office announced that the scheme that was supposed to be introduced this year was being delayed. So it is a fact that it's been delayed. Now, it may be no fault of this government that it's been delayed. It may be simply because there just wasn't enough preparation. And that may be down to the last government. But the fact that Starmer said it's just not true is not correct, in fact. Because I say the Home Office has made this. So it felt like a tense moment. Sunak actually looked a little bit embarrassed at that point. And it all got slightly uncomfortable. I wonder whether, in fact, the Prime Minister will now have to correct the record, because as I understand it, it has been delayed.
Well, he then went on a bit of a rant, didn't he, about 14 years of Tory failure, which we've heard a million times before, and
which didn't feel appropriate, given that this was not really a party political exchange.
And it felt rather vexatious to listen to. The only thing I thought Sunak did stray into party politics when he was talking about the Freedom of Speech Act. Now, it may indeed be true that that is about defending, campuses against Chinese interference. I always thought that it was more a sort of anti-woke bill to stop campuses from, if that's the right terminology, as they would call it, in terms of stopping campuses from restricting, speakers that...
It was about cancel culture, wasn't it?
Yeah, I kind of felt it was. Anyway, Anushka, what did you make?
Well, I think one of the things you see is that Rishi Sunak, as the former Prime Minister, knows everything about what's happening in government and has still got good contacts, which is how he knew last week that national insurance contributions for employers was going to increase, and that he's very across what's happening here. He also started off with this thing that was in The Guardian the other day. Elena Courier wrote a story about a suggestion that because David Lammy is going to visit China, that a visit here to an all APPG group, let's just go safe, of the former Taiwanese president has been delayed as a result of that, which also just kind of builds into this idea that that kind of relationship with China, how you manage that relationship with China, particularly given the threats that we're seeing at the moment, is very, very, very tricky for this government. All that said, I was really surprised that Rishi Sunak didn't go on tax. But the simple fact is, he, in that election campaign, repeatedly said, they're going to raise your taxes. Mark my words, they're going to raise your taxes. He's now got exactly what he was warning of. He has been proven right. I was sort of amazed that he didn't take the opportunity to go hard on that.
Well, he might do it next week. We've got still a couple of weeks, as we pointed out, till the budget.
Let's talk about the budget in 2 seconds, but just very briefly before we do, we've had a few PMQs now, haven't we? We've sort of been watching them both. I sort of found myself thinking Keir Starmer isn't as good at this as I thought he would be. He seems kind of quite brittle at times, and Rishi Sunak is a lot better leader of the opposition than I thought he would be. Now, you might say, well, look, one's an easy job and one's quite hard, and that would also be true. But I find myself thinking Starmer's got a bit of a way to go before he feels confident at the dispatch box. And Rishi Sunak, I kind of find myself thinking, you know what, if he'd had a few years as leader of the opposition before he ran for, election, maybe he would have been a better Prime Minister. What do you both think?
I definitely think it was the wrong moment for Rishi Sunak to become leader of the Conservative Party. And when you ask him or any of those around him about that, they say, well, he had no choice, that he had already run once, and that it was in the kind of wake of the mini budget and the kind of economic instability we were seeing, it was the right thing to do, his duty to do it. But it was, I think, probably destined to fail from the beginning. I think he made it harder for himself because probably his strengths are more on the technocratic side, which isn't necessarily what you need after 12 years, was it, when he came in of a Conservative government? You needed to be political.
Yeah.
And that was the thing that even William Hague, one of his closest, his mentor, said to me, I admit Rishi Sunak's weakness is probably party politics, whilst he thinks he was very good at all the other stuff.
I suppose what I mean is, I think he might have got better at the other stuff if he'd had a bit more of a run-in.
That's blatantly a reasonable thing to say. I think it also, just looking at them both, shows you how much the cares of office weigh on your ability to perform on that.
She looks like she's not
poor Rachel
sleeping
Reeves looks exhausted. She's obviously working around the clock at the moment. But with this, what will be probably the most important budget, possibly the most important political event they control of their time in office coming up in 2 weeks' time. But Rishi Sunak no longer has the cares of office. He's liberated, and he's showing quite a lot of dexterity. And as you say, is performing better than he did perform at the dispatch box when he was in government. I would say, look, a lot has gone wrong for this Labour government. It looks to me as though the pressure. I mean, essentially, Keir Starmer is now feeling the pressure. He did this thing. It's not the first time he's done it. He referred to Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister during PMQs. It's a sort of easy mistake to make, but it sort of shows you that he's not on his game. Many would say that the investment conference summit that they just held went pretty well for them. They were able to announce, big numbers in terms of inward investment into the UK. Some of that would have happened probably even if Sunak had been in power, but not all of it. So it looked pretty good from the point of view of the Prime Minister. But when he talked to those business leaders, I have to say, most of the address was fine, but the bit at the beginning where he talked about how he had long hair and was playing the flute at the Guildhall, it felt weird.
I once pursued a fleeting ambition to play the flute professionally. I kid you not. Complete with then long hair and very, very flared jeans. All photographic evidence has been destroyed, I'm afraid.
It felt like he was trying to seem relaxed in a time when he's not relaxed and he's just not quite pitching it right. Well, so I think he's not quite feeling comfortable in office.
There'll be a lot of people listening to this, watching this, who want to know what's in the budget. Quite frankly, we know the whole country is slightly on the edge of its seat about that. Before we get into talking about the politics of it, I just want to, for those who are wondering, to summarise the sort of coverage that you've both done over the last 10 days or so. As far as I understand it, we're now looking at high likelihood that they will force employers to pay national insurance contributions on the money they put into employees' pensions.
Yeah.
Pretty much
we talked about that last week.
But I think that is going to happen.
Yeah.
We're talking about raising the top rate of capital gains tax.
The basic rate.
Basic rate, sorry.
Of capital gains tax to somewhere between 30 and 35%.
30 and 35%.
It's currently about 20. It's not currently about 20. It's currently 20%.
Yeah.
Right. And as I understand it, they're looking at raising it to between 30 and 35%. I think they made the final decision. But probably coupling that with a modification of the the tax-free allowance you receive when you sell your assets, so that smaller business entrepreneurs, not the megabucks people, but those, the entrepreneurs who are creating smaller businesses, don't get too hard hit by this change, so that it doesn't deter to too great an extent business startups.
Are those the two big tax-raising measures?
They're the two big tax-raising measures, as I understand it.
Yeah.
So there was a story last week that had suggested there were papers inside the Treasury, which, by the way, they furiously denied, and they were furious about the story, that they'd been modelling up to 39% on capital gains tax. And when you asked them on that, it was very clear, A, that that's completely untrue, as Robert was saying there, but B, that the Treasury has actually modelled that that's when you start deterring investment. That's when you start having not even start, at that point, basically capital gains tax isn't going to raise you the amount that you think it's going to raise you. So they were very keen to be clear.
And actually, Keir Starmer said on the record only a day or so ago that ain't going to happen, right?
We assume, always a bad idea, I guess, to second guess budgets, but at the same time, they've framed this one fairly clearly. I guess we're assuming that there's going to be these two potentially nasty tax rises for those that are going to have to pay them, which they've now trailed quite heavily. But on the flip side, there's probably going to be, a big program of investment and so on and so forth.
So they're changing the fiscal rules, as we've said, to allow more investment, more borrowing for investment. Yeah.
So what is your sense of the politics? Is your guess that this whole business of potentially breaking a manifesto promise, there'll be a huge argument about that, is your best guess that they'll probably get away with it because people think, well, it's a bit technical, it's on employers, or do you think it'll burn up into a huge row?
I definitely think there's a big trust issue. I actually think it's a completely reasonable tax to rise. They could have made the argument for raising that tax. They probably should have made the argument before the election. I think they can point to their notes that suggested at the time of the manifesto that they were only talking about employee national insurance. But I still think there is a bit of a trust issue. And that's the problem. Like the thing that Keir Starmer needed to change when he came into power was to try and lift up people's trust in politicians, because it is on the floor. And if you speak to people in Downing Street, they know that that is a massive issue. But the combination of the freebies row, the donors row, and now raising taxes where you suggested that you weren't going to raise them, I think is going to cause a trust issue. That said, the bigger package around it, and particularly the change of the fiscal rules, which, by the way, could also be argued as a trust issue because they said they weren't going to do that either, is also going to allow them to spend all that money on capital, as you mentioned. And I do think ultimately they have got 5 years. They haven't got 1 year, they've got 5 years. And ultimately they are going to be judged on whether we can visibly see any change in our lives. You know, just the other day, I was in A&E with a loved one and we were there for still a very, very long time. And it felt like a very kind of clunky, difficult process. And I think I said this before the election. I think I had another time in A&E with another relative over many hours. And I think every time a person has an experience like that, they blame it on the government. They feel annoyed with the government. The way this government will ultimately be judged is whether they can change things like that.
I mean, the other striking change in the sort of rhetoric of ministers shows that the penny has dropped. I mean, many would say dropped way later than you would expect it to drop. That if they really want to build confidence among voters, they've got to fix the NHS. So you will now, pretty much any time a minister opens their mouth, they talk about the importance of fixing the NHS. So one of the things that I now expect to be a big part of the budget, some of it will be the allocation of these billions of additional investment money, is an enormous allocation to the NHS. So I think it's going to be an absolute centrepiece of the budget. I think a lot of it will be investment in things like scanners, in fixing hospitals, in terms of IT, AI to help with diagnosis, to help with appointments. So I think they will certainly, along with all the pain of increasing taxes, and indeed one of the things I know they're working on is something that you might have associated more with the previous government, although in the past, let's be clear, although they talk about it, they didn't actually achieve it. There will be quite a lot of talk about eliminating waste, eliminating unnecessary projects. This will be a two-stage process. There'll be a lot of talk about it in the budget, and then that will be postponed a few months to the spending review, which will come in the spring. But they are definitely fixated on making the public sector in general more efficient. But I think there will be a huge focus on providing really quite big resources to the NHS.
And that does, by the way, then feed through to your day-to-day spending. Like, I remember sitting in a conference with Conservative health ministers in the previous government where people were talking to us about like how if you redesign a ward in a hospital, you can literally improve productivity by 20% immediately and therefore deal with those waiting lists and so on.
Okay, quick final question to both of you. Robert, on inflation, interest rates coming down, do you think, and sooner than we expected?
Look, I would be staggered if we don't get an interest rate cut actually at the next MPC meeting. And
which is November, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And let's be absolutely clear. I mean, obviously, it'll be slightly conditioned by the nature of the budget, right? I mean, and because which will be another factor. But just on the basis of inflationary conditions that we can see, there needs to be another cut sooner rather than later. I would argue that the Bank of England has been consistently behind the curve. I would say these figures showed they should have cut more already. But anyway, I think they will cut in November. Just one political point, though, right? The big story, one of the top 3 stories the last 2 or 3 years, has been inflation, right? I don't think inflation is now significantly below the 2% target. It may not settle there. The energy prices have gone up. It may go back to 2% or a bit above 2% for a bit. But I don't think there was a single reference in PMQs today to the inflation figures, which is sort of does my head in, right? Nobody mentioned it.
It's not a bigger story than Taylor Swift. We're agreed about that. Okay, Anushka, final question to you. We shouldn't forget the Tory leadership election.
No.
Any thoughts?
Well, what are my thoughts on it? I mean, it is going to feel very, very different in PMQs when we've got a result to this. And, I think that it feels like Kemi Badenoch is the favourite at the moment to win this, and she's got a totally different style to Rishi Sunak. I think we're going to see a complete change if she wins it. I mean, obviously, Robert Jenrick is trying to outflank her on the right at the moment by promising more kind of concrete things like leaving the European Convention on Human Rights, like putting Jacob Rees-Mogg in as his chair if he wins, which I do think makes it tighter. But for all the shenanigans that I think the teams were up to try and keep Kemi Badenoch off the ballot to the end, it has obviously not worked, and she remains very popular with Conservative members. And then we will start to see a massive change in the kind of dynamic. As much as it is really interesting to see Rishi Sunak as opposition leader, and I think he's been very gracious in the move to opposition leader, I don't think we'll really understand what the dynamics are going to be like.
That's all for this week. Thanks very much for joining us. Remember, you can watch new episodes on ITVX and indeed on YouTube every Wednesday, and you can also listen on your favourite podcast platform. Why not subscribe to ensure you won't miss out on an episode, and indeed you will make all of our day. See you next time.